Hello, everyone. Welcome to the Rise of Good Witch podcast. Today we have our old favorite guest coming back again today, the amazing, the talented, the brilliant Sanyu Estelle.
Yeah, thank you.
Welcome. How are you? We were just talking about how we are, but how for everybody listening, how are you, Sanyu?
I am okay. It's weird times. August is over. It's August 31st, audience. So we are saying goodbye to the eighth month of 2021 already. It feels like a profoundly confusing time. So the fact that I'm okay feels like I'm good as opposed to just being like, it's mediocre. No, it feels like fine. I'm stable. That seems good in this day and age. How are you?
Yeah, I relate to that, and I feel like that's like a great jumping off point for our conversation. I feel like, yeah, considering everything happening, I'm good. Um, yeah, I'm really, like I said, I'm really excited to talk to you today. And I listened to our last episode, Tarot as a Tool for Liberation, which now is a year old.
Wow.
And I got a chance to sort of review what we talked about before. And it made me think about, well, we'll get into it, but I feel like some of the things that you said in the last episode felt like they were like readings for me for the future. So I will like be bringing that up. But I guess what were we calling the episode? Can you just read it?
Oh, yes, I just had it pulled up. Let me bring it up. We are calling the episode Tarot for Adapting to a Post-Pandemic World Approaching Climate Collapse.
Very
Oh, and no, that was our first title. Sorry, we did change it actually. I am totally lying. Then you emailed me back because we were like, I'm back, I'm ready. And now we're calling it.
No, I think that the what
That
you
was it? I was correct? Okay, you could be right.
Yeah, I mean, and it's funny because we're not in a post-pandemic world, you know?
You're right.
And I really started saying that like we're in a post-pandemic world, and now that we're looking at what's happening, we're clearly not. And it sort of reminds me of the discourse around the idea of being post-colonial and how that's not really a thing. And it took me a while to understand that like we're still in colonialism, we're still in pandemic. According to many climate scientists, we actually are in climate apocalypse. Like it's not coming, it is already beginning.
It's here.
So it's 2021. A lot has changed in the last year and a lot has stayed the same. So it's almost like I think both of us, and we'll get into this, both of us being like, yeah, I'm good. But like, why am I good? It's sort of like this is the new normal. So
Right. Exactly.
yeah, so I would love for us to just begin, speaking about the Hierophant, however folks want to pronounce it, year and how it's been, what our takeaways so far have been, and also our personal card of the year, using what is known as like the Morgan Greer numerology method of figuring out your card of the year. So do you want to start or do you want me to start?
Host, it's your first podcast in a while, so I'll let you go first if you want to. It doesn't matter to me.
Okay, I will. Yeah, so the Hierophant year. And, I will say, one of the things I was really thinking about with the Hierophant, and, we did the first episode of the year was a spell for the collective with many of former guests of this podcast, including yourself.
Yes.
And we kind of like talked about what we were hoping for or what we were bringing in for the year. And I think like for me, there hasn't been a lot of time to reflect on the bigger, well, there has been a lot of time to reflect on the bigger picture, but in terms of how it relates to a Hierophant year, what I think about a lot is the fact that the Hierophant is a 5. And the 5s are known, I call them, like when I teach tarot, the way that I look at it is the 5s are a plateau. A lot of times in the minors, we're like moving on up, like 1 to 4 is like progress, depending. And then you get to a 5 and there's like a stuntedness. There is a collapse of some sort sometimes, like a not a like severe structural collapse, but a deep grief. I think going back to the idea of grief, like there is a grief in the fives because there's a reckoning with our own abilities or lack of abilities. So when I think about Hierophant, again, we think about the teacher. And as I've been feeling, the Hierophant year is about being our own guide. We're not looking outward. We're not like looking externally. We're looking internally to find our own truth. And of course, like that gets complicated because we've got a lot of like political upheaval right now. Like I'm very interested in like conspiracy theories and like crime.
Me too.
Yeah, like so I will go into like a black hole of like
YouTube videos.
Yes, absolutely. Yeah. So I feel like the Hierophant is about deciphering information for ourselves, but then the problem is, and this is a bigger conversation, so many people are so stuck in like this national and historical gaslighting that has happened that there isn't the ability to decipher reality with like an awareness of what is actually happening. So that's the interesting thing about the fives is like it is a reckoning in a way. It's a grief and a reckoning. And like, are you able to look at that mirror and look within? And I think like the Hierophant year, there was a lot of predictions I remember towards the end of the year about how in the Hierophant year we were going to see a lot of like public accountability and calling out of spiritual leaders and spiritual guides who have been problematic. And we see that with
That's true.
Yes. Do you think that's happened a lot this year?
I've seen it happen. I mean, even I don't remember when the John of God thing happened, but that was the beginning for me of the downfall because John of God was like Oprah. He was like early, the 70s est spiritual group kind of guru. When I found out he was enslaving women in his basement and impregnating them and selling these children to people who wanted John of God children. When I started reading that, I was like, oh, we're on a, and then just this month, Teal Swan. And she and went into a basic surgery and she never came out, but her scandals did.
Wow.
So I totally agree that that's happened. Because at first when you were saying it, I was like wondering if you're going to say it about politicians. And I was like, that's kind of happened. But then when you moved to the spiritual leaders, I was like, yeah, no, I do feel that in the spiritual community.
Yeah, I'm going to have to look into those because I'm just really, maybe it's the Pluto in the first house for me. I'm just really fascinated by like the fall of people that have a lot of power and like their secrets and like what they keep from others. And like what, and that's, I don't want to get in like a whole, like going off on a whole offshoot about QAnon because we could be here all day, but it's like a lot of those people that follow that, I would say it's like, there's some true, like, okay, I don't want to, like, there's no, what I mean is like, they're like, yeah, you're right to be skeptical of the system. You're right to be skeptical of the way things are run. You're right to think that there are secrets, but maybe you're putting it in the wrong place. Like maybe you actually need to be distrustful more of like institutional harm doers, like prison systems, instead of like this mythical, world of child trafficking, that exists as QAnon describes it. So anyway, like, yeah, I definitely want to look into those people you're speaking about, but I think like the Hierophant tells us to be our own guide because whenever we look outside of ourselves, we can invalidate or devalue our own experience. And then that kind of brings me into like where I've been, which is in my star year. And I've been looking forward to this one because I was thinking about it. I started Rise of Good Witch in my Hanged one year. So I've been going through all the like hard cards through this, and it's been horrifying and great at the same time. And getting to the star, it was like, okay, this is the respite, this is the retrieval. But the star almost for me became like Tower Part 2. Like Tower Part 2 with me with better tools to deal with it. And I think of the star as reciprocity, boundaries, accessibility, understanding our accessibility, being able to communicate what we need from others. But
Mhm.
then also, I think, with the star and the Hierophant together, it's been about, um, oh, I just lost my thought. I just lost it. It was like working up to it.
You're saying you went through all the hard cards and you were ready for respite,
Mhm.
and but you felt like the star was tower too.
Yeah, I think it's just been sort of like this idea of like understanding, because I've always thought like the star is, in terms of like the sun, moon, and star, the star is about finding your people and recognizing that not everybody is your people. Like, not everyone's going to validate you, not everyone's going to be aligned with you, not everyone's going to agree with you, not everyone's going to understand you. And the star is about finding those people and finding community with them. So I think like that's definitely, been true for me. But also, yeah, like dealing with my autoimmune stuff,
Mhm.
making really good choices for my health, recognizing ways that I still, like there's a lot of unhealthy patterns I had when I was younger that they're still showing up in other ways that I'm like, that's not the same thing. And it really is. And I think Star is a good reflection for like who we are in crisis, who we are, when we need to take care of ourselves and when we need to rely on ourselves for that care and we're not looking for it outwardly. And the other thing, okay, this is the thing that I was thinking is like, for me, I think this has been a big year of understanding that only I can validate my experience. Like, if I can't validate my experiences, if I can't validate my pain, I'm going to be an empty vessel, like looking for everyone else to validate me. And it's never going to fill my vessel. Like, I have to be the one to give that to myself. So that's been like a big lesson for the star. It's just like we have to nurture ourselves and nurture the ones that we love. And we can't like outsource it to someone else, which is also, a reflection of the Hierophant.
Yes. Also, of course you took like your first podcast break and maybe forever during your star year. So
Yep.
that was also a
Yep.
big part of your regeneration.
Hmm.
Interesting. Okay, I love hearing that about the hero font because I think, well, one, I at least since I started reading tarot, the hero font. In fact, the first card that followed me around was the Eight of Swords. And that followed me around before I even knew I was going to be in cards. It was like I was at Burning Man. I would always be finding like the Eight of Spades or the Eight of Diamonds, or whenever I found a tarot deck, it would typically be the Eight of Swords. When I started reading cards, I graduated from the Eight of Swords category, and the Hierophant started being the card that showed up for me all the time. And the way that I thought about it, I totally agree with you. I think it is very much about being your own guidance, and I think it's also about recognizing the multi-dimensionality of truth and wisdom. And the reason I think that the Hierophant represents finding your own guidance is because, and I've been thinking about this recently, like wisdom isn't linear. There's no indication that wisdom is coming down the line. Like, you can meet 3-year-olds who are wiser than 50-year-olds. So there's no heteronormative, linear, uh like ordered way with which all knowledge is disseminated. Like, anyone can be wiser than you just if they incorporate their experiences with more maturity and like more willingness to acknowledge their issues. And that is not predicated on age. It's not necessarily even predicated on experience. And so I think what's wonderful about the hang person, I was just looking at that. That's one of my cards later, folks. I ruined it for you. But one of my thoughts about the Hierophant, especially because it feels like it's been the card that's been coming up in my card readings given to me by other people for probably like 7 years now, at least. It feels very much like the appropriate year of culmination, because when we are looking around, I mean, I've been telling clients since beginning of 2020 that were that COVID has created uh it has taken away a veneer that for thousands of years there has been a logical, linear, ordered, sedentary, one-dimensional story. And then COVID came through and basically helped people realize, oh, like there's always been 7.5 billion realities, and we've all convinced ourselves that this is the way things had to be because that was the train we're on. But COVID and Earth and like existence came through to remind us that like that's actually not in the natural order of things, and that all things existed once and all truths are true, and that you can choose whatever truth is like truthiest to you, which is how I do think we get to the QAnon, and that how we or QAnon. I don't even know what y'all's are called, you conspiracy theorists. That's how we get to the QAnon, and how we get to, you know, rampant like people who arguably have done very well under the I was going to call it the success model, but let me call it the lead by capitalism model, right? Lead by capitalism model, whether that's a Teal Swan who built a yoga empire as a white lady and was a part of the Bikram community, and also ended up being a QAnon person and all kind of denier. And then we also have, you know, the Jeff Bezoses and these people who are arguably like leading by capitalism. And we're now finally in a watershed moment or an apex moment of that Hierophant wisdom can come from everywhere. Where in the past, let's say in a pre 2019 world, where there would still be, I think, a larger audience for this kind of success. Oh, you know, he took his dick spaceship into the exit, like the end of the Earth's atmosphere, not even technically into space, in the end of the Earth's atmosphere for 10 minutes, like goals, you know? And I think that there's less appreciation for that kind of like gratuitous leadership. Um, and so for me, it's a perfect Hierophant year in the sense that you have had to rely on yourself, and sometimes even the way that you do that proves to be very temporal, you know, because I think sometimes we get a routine that we're like, oh, I feel secure in this, and you're like, I'll use this for the rest of my life, and then things happen and you're like, that wasn't even viable for 6 months, you know. But I think that that's very Hierophanty in the sense that any expectation of time frames, any expectation of order, any expectation of like elevation is flipped, and we're almost in like a what I like to call the vortex of unequilibrium, which is what I tell my clients is the no person's land, no man's land between two belief systems. When you realize, oh, what, like when you're like, oh my God, the only thing keeping me from believing in like being a Seventh Day Adventist and an atheist is like my choosing. And sometimes when we realize that, like, oh my God, it's really, I'm the cosigner, then you fall into the vortex of equilibrium and you're like, oh my God, I'm in control. It's me. How will I do this? The earth is crazy. And then you get to this point where you're like, okay, relax. I've been doing this choosing my whole life. I just wasn't aware I was doing this choosing. And so I think the Hierophant is aware of how much they are choosing their belief, their destiny, their ideology. And I totally agree that it leaves you with a lot of enthusiasm to believe something, but because we're in a world of snake oil salespeople, it's just, you know, it's just sort of funny. I mean, I'm not going to deny, as a Hierophant person and just as like a sarcastic social justice warrior, I think it's funny to see how logical or how rational or how like together humanity imagines itself to be, and then one thing happens and you're like, not so much, right? So that's the funny part, but it's also interesting just to see how unsupported people felt by the belief systems that they had, which is why everything has sort of gone out rather than stacked up. So I find the Hierophant year to be like that. And then I was talking to Krina before we started about what technically my tarot year is. And it's either, if we do double digits, it's death. If we do one digit, it's emperor. And I mean, in the relationship between them, it definitely feels like the death of the emperor. Um, in general, uh, and it continues to be a death card year for me for the obvious reasons. Obviously, the when we did Tarot for Grief, which I guess was in winter of 2020.
Yeah.
Is that when we must have been, because that's when my dad passed. So I've been just dealing with the aftermath of that for some time. And just the recognition of, I guess this sounds like a not so great, but like the life goes on aspect of death, where you're like, oh, this is actually what we call death is a change. And now that this change has happened, the space has to be filled differently. I talk about this with people whose parents passed or family members passed who are important. It's like the entire, and this is true of friend groups too, of course, and spiritual communities and stuff. Everybody takes up space, and that space allows everybody else to take up the space they're taking. So when someone passes or transitions from the earth, that space is vacated, and now everyone has to rearrange their space taking in that space. And I think with families that happens, especially if you're in a friend group that's close knit like a family, that can be the really like dramatic, like destruction, decomposition aspect of death, where you're like negotiating emotional, spiritual, physical territory, trying to fulfill a role that had been taken as far as you knew for the whole entirety of your life or for the entirety of the time that it did. So that we very much still feel like we're in the decay era of the death cycle. I very much know I'm in the decay area of the death cycle, still shedding a lot of things, and mostly shedding, I wouldn't even call them expectations, because I think in this line of business, expectations is relative. Like what you're going to be doing with your career in 10 years when you're in the spiritual, like we're making this shit up as we go along. But the death of any, and I already didn't use the word normal like a regular word, but like any idea of normalcy has kind of been laid to rest during my death year. Whereas I'm like, yeah, I mean, we're good, not quite the dog in the house burning, but like, whenever we watch these post-apocalyptic films or these like major event films, terrible things are happening, like they're happening in the world all the time in different regions than let's call what we call the first world. But in an apocalyptic film, it's almost like this hyper awareness that you are in those films like fighting for survival, and then you're like, but survival of what? What do I even care about? Like, what am I trying to preserve? What's the point of all this if it's all going to go to hell in a handbasket? And that's where I'm at right now, which is like, okay, well, if the world ends tomorrow, or if someone else dies, like what matters to me? And that's been kind of 2021, which is why it hasn't been consistent. Nothing has happened from one month to the next that has gone the way that I thought it would. But I've survived it all, and I've managed it, and I still have a sense of humor. So I also find, for some reason, that humor is a necessary part of the death card. But maybe that's because I have Hierophant energy, so I'm recognizing it as change on a cellular level, even though it's like death happens to generally be change I don't prefer. It's still natural change in the order of existence. So I appreciate it, because even, I mean, and this is true of our generation, I think, like, even the way that death is spoken about has to go through a reconstruction, just the way that society and life was talked about with COVID being like, it's just like, to be honest, I don't think COVID is the death reckoner. Like when I was reading, I was doing an article on the invention of whiteness, her presentation, and I was just looking through the history of Europe from 1000 to 2000, like literally. There's been so many wars, And oh, why did I say that? I was talking about death. Hero font.
You
Oh,
don't
right.
COVID, yeah.
Right. Yeah. So the bubonic plague. This thing lasted like 10 years. 35 million people died in 10 years. We're looking at 600,000 people with COVID, which is more than all of our 1900 wars combined. World War One, World Two, Vietnam, all of these, Korean War, every war we've ever fought. So, and look at people. This is what people are doing, at 500,000. Imagine 35 million people in a day, in a year, in an incident, like tsunamis happening all the time. That brings people into a place of, I think, sobriety that we haven't quite hit yet. We're not in the sobriety phase of death yet. So it's still really messy and emotional and reactive. And in the youth stage, I think the first stages of death or grief are like our child stage, where we're like, fuck all this and terrible and hate you. So we're still there. I feel a little bit removed from that, but I completely am not surprised and understand the witnessing of it, even in my own life.
Wow. There was so much that you just said that like ties into like other cards I'm thinking about. So I'm going to try to like pull
Okay.
from that. But yeah, there is a lot that you said that's true about, and just, yeah, putting that into perspective. Thank you for putting that into perspective of like, we have lost more than 500,000 people, and people are like, don't tell me to wear a mask. I want to go to a baseball game, whatever, like, and you're just like, and that is just a level of cultural denial that has been happening. I mean, it's definitely been happening since the quote unquote birth of a nation, but it has also been happening, I'm sure, like throughout time.
Yes.
Of just like, I want to believe that things are staying this way. And yeah, a lot of this I'm gonna I'm gonna like stop that, because a lot of this goes into some of the other cards
Okay.
that I chose. So let's go to, we both chose Six of Swords, and I had thought about it. I've been thinking about Six of Swords all year, and I forgot to mention it. And then you brought it up, and I was like, I don't want to steal. I'm not trying to steal your thunder, but I also want to talk about that. So I guess I'll go first. I wanted you to go first, but since
yeah, I just talked. Yeah, fair
yeah.
enough.
So the Six of Swords is interesting because I wanted to start by saying, and I emailed you about this. One of my students in Tarot School for Liberation said this, and they said where they got this, or maybe they made this interpretation up. If you are listening, student, I don't remember who you are. I'm giving you credit. So please send me a message and tell me that you were the one that said this, so I can like give you a shout out. A student said that the Six of Swords was the current self, the self in this moment, giving the child self and the elder self, taking the child self and the elder self on a journey for personal betterment in that moment. So the idea of like, the work that you do today is for your future self and for your inner child.
Ashe.
And I was like, wow, that's amazing. Because the way that I see Six of Swords, obviously the sword suit is one that brings up a lot of negative emotions for people. People tend to think of it as really like carcel and like punitive. And really, I think that's a testament to our own minds, and kind of like what you're talking about with like leadership and capitalism and, Teal Swan and Jeff Bezos and these like people. When there's too much thinking, that can become rumination. And that's like something I really teach around the swords, is that like, this is about perception. This isn't necessarily about what's going on around you. This is about your perception of what's going on around you. So when we see the Six of Swords, and I still haven't like fully I'm going to be in a process of fully grasping all the cards for my whole life. But I think like the thing about Six of Swords is I see it as one of the really, I guess, like, for lack of a better word, like positive or hopeful cards in the swords, because we see someone doing work that there's no reward to the work in the Six of Swords. it's work that you have to do. It's necessary. It's necessary for growth, for liberation, for healing, but it's not fun. A lot of times I see the Six of Swords as like a death doula card, palliative care card, accountability process. It's like something that is not fun, but you're doing it for the greater good of your life. And for the lives of someone else. So sometimes that's why I think like death doula, palliative care, it's like, I think like a caregiving element comes up in this. Like you have to take care of someone because that's what you need to do to be, a part of like a greater society, a greater community, a family unit, a family structure. And it's not, there's no reward on the other side of it. It's just like an obligation, but it's an obligation that will make you better. How that goes on to the 7, because I think the 7 is very conniving. That's the part where I'm like, if you're doing a noble act of the 6 of Swords, why do you end up at the 7, thus the 8, thus the 9, But with the 6, I think also something I was really thinking about is like this idea, I'm going to look at my notes because I like took notes on all this. And I also wrote down, by the way, flower essences I recommend for each of these.
Hey, exciting.
Yeah. So I think it's like, yeah, definitely it's like a difficult, necessary journey. You need a lot of focus and concentration. One thing that like Rachel Pollack mentions in 78 Degrees of Wisdom is about like the fragility of the canoe, 3 people in the canoe on the water. Like you have to have a lot of focus and concentration, and the stakes are high. You've got 6 swords in there. So you have to be focused to make sure the canoe doesn't topple over. And then I also think about this because, the swords are air, the element of air, but we see so much water in this card, like at least in the traditional depiction in the Smith Rider-Waite. And what I think about that, like, so if water's emotions and swords are intellect and thought process, and consciousness, there's obviously, we want to bring those together. That's the ideal way of being, that's like the ideal, like Hierophant, spiritual guidance way is for our thoughts to be aligned with our emotions, to them, and the lack of that happening, which is again, like goes back to a lot of what you're saying about, people just like not accepting that, we're in this, time of great, loss and death. And like you said, it isn't like the ultimate, like we've got more stuff coming. The idea of falling into the water. So there is this sort of like emotional, there's sort of like, it's almost kind of like the way that we both began this conversation where we're both like, I'm good, but like everything's crazy, is sort of like, you have to do what you need to do to get through the difficult moments. It's like things are going to be hard and there's no way through it. There's no way out but through, or what's that statement? Like,
only way out is through, I think.
Yeah, you're right. The only way out is through. Yeah. So it's sort of like that. It's like the emotions are there. You're grounded in the emotions, but you're protected from them. And I thought about that, like, and we're both talking about grief and like losing someone, and I feel like when I first went through an experience of losing someone that I was very, very close to, like that first day, it really felt like I was in a raft. It felt like the emotions were all around me, but I had no access to them and I couldn't feel them because the shock was so great. I don't know if that, that is relatable to you as well, but it's like almost like that 6 of Swords is like, you're just trying to get to point A to point B. There's no space right now to like get into all of this grief. And I feel like for me also, like Hierophant year has been like that. Like there's a lot of things that I need to grieve and accept from this last year, a lot of loss. And, also just like my health, like dealing with health stuff, dealing with relational stuff that I can't, it's not always fully safe to like be in those emotions, So it's like there's some protection in that as well. And then I have for people that are watching the video, the Sarah Calvary's 8th House Tarot has the astrological association. So 6 of Swords is Mercury in Aquarius. So we think about that as like really, really innovative, but also kind of detached communication, again, because we think of Aquarius as being like kind of emotionally detached, almost emotionally removed, while being also very like innovative. And the flower essences that I thought of for this card would be, somebody who's like dealing with something like this would definitely be like Ocotillo, which it has like a grief component, has boundaries component. We have to think about boundaries when we're doing hard work for others, when we're trying to protect ourselves from like, losing ourselves in our own emotions or our own grief. Mullen because of the grief, Mullen because of, the strength of it. And then Moonstone Essence is actually for traveling over water. So I thought that was perfect. And then I put Star of Bethlehem because that's like a really good essence for trauma healing work and inner child work.
Yeah, and also when you're saying borders, you have to think of the borders of the boat. Like there's only so much room in there for you to maneuver. That's so wonderful. I wanted to, when you said Teal Swan, I had to go look up that name because I was like, I might be fucking this up because I'm not a yogi. I totally was fucking it up. Teal Swan is like an American critic who I was talking about. Was
Okay.
Guru Jagat.
Oh, okay.
Yes, Guru Jagat is who's Teal Swan is very much alive and very much not a yogi. So
Okay. Okay.
apologies
Good
to
to
you,
know.
Teal Swan, and to your ancestors. Guru Jagat is who created um the applied yogic Rama. She created Rama on the applied yogic sciences and technology. This huge Venice like white woman lattes brand, and she's the one who just passed away this month at 41.
Oh, okay.
Guru Jagat, okay, audience, not Teal Swan. I know people who were listening and knowing were like, what the fuck is she talking about? So the Six of Swords. I chose the Six of Swords for, let me look up our title again because it's actually very important for our title. Tarot for adapting to post-pandemic world approaching climate collapse. So the reason that I chose the Six of Swords, and you'll see from me, audience, that I mostly chose Major Arcana. So the Six of Swords is actually pretty significant because I only chose 2 minor Arcana cards. But I chose it because I feel like the Six of Swords is one of the most neutral grief cards in the tarot. There's a lot of grief cards. Obviously, we have the Nine of Swords, Lamentation. We have the Five of Cups. We have the Six of Swords. To an extent, we even have like the Eight of Wands, like cards that were like, why me kind of thing. And the Six of Swords is very much like, and in the way that you were describing it, it's not about where you're coming from or your destination. It's about the journey with the Six of Swords, and it's about where you're at, and it's about dealing with where you're at and crossing, getting out of the boat once you arrive at land and not worrying about the land until you're out of the boat. And I think there's a temporalness to the Six of Swords that's actually really necessary for that air and intellect energy, especially the aspect that you said about it being in the water, because I always talk about the swords as intellectual intelligence or intellectualizing emotions. And the example I love to give to people about that is like, wow, I'm like so depressed and like heartbroken, is what your feelings tell you. That's your emotional intelligence giving you information. And then your mind's like, we don't have time to be heartbroken, bitch. Like, you gotta go make money. Fuck your grief. And your feelings are like, whoa, very rude. We're still here, but okay, I guess we're going back to work and we'll just shut up while we're over there. And it's how you invalidate your own self, because in our, patriarchal supremacy ideationist civilization, we have overemphasized the necessity of intellectual intelligence over even the bodily intelligence or emotional intelligence or spiritual intelligence or erotic intelligence, environmental intelligence. Any of these things have been overridden by the idea that like the mind is supposed to figure it out. And the thing I love to give to people is like, your intellect, your body, and your emotions are a team, and I love to use the fire as an example. It's like when you're young, your mind thinks the idea of touching fire is cool. It's ephemeral, it's interesting, it's warm. If you watch enough movies or read enough books, you probably think that like you can do that without being hurt, because there's all sort of like fire power fantasies in the American like archetypal mind, in the American, but in the global archetypal mind. And yet your body will be like, don't do that, because it's going to hurt you. The mind doesn't know that. The mind just wants to do what it wants. It's the emotional intelligence between those two that allows you to make the best decision, because some people don't mind being burned. Maybe they're like, that was cool, I'll survive whatever, burnt thumb, but I'll practice that. Other people are like, I don't like feeling burned, so I'm not going to do that again. And it's your emotional intelligence that allows you to make course correcting decisions between what your intellect wants to do and what your body knows it has been capable of. Because I think we teach our body and we teach ourselves all the time that, whoa, I didn't know I had that in me. Or like, no wonder I passed out and have a, autoimmune issue. I was ignoring my allergies for 10 years, personally speaking for myself. So I think with swords, even though it's a less loved minor arcana suit, it's less loved because the intellectual intelligence is overemphasized. And so it has become a critic, where it's like, oh, you want me to do that job too? Oh, you want me to do that job too? Oh, you want me to do that job too? So I always tell people in tarot, like, swords is our negotiations with ourself. Cups is our negotiations in our one-on-one intimate relationships. Wands is our negotiation with our identity versus how the world receives us. And that Pentacles is our negotiation with the actual physical environment. And so, of course, people don't like swords because you have to deal with yourself. And I like the Six of Swords because it's only you on that boat. Even in the old-fashioned tarot where there's the Wayfarer, for instance, in this is the melanated Rider-Waite. But it's like, this person is typically like a silent figure. Even in Greek mythology and stuff, it's almost like they're like a foil, or a guy like in a video game where they're just the person that you go to get the information, and they repeat themselves, like they're only programmed with that information, and so they're there to get you somewhere but not to give you something. And so even when you're on this boat, you're like, you're not talking to this guy, he's not telling you where you're going, you don't have any information like that, it's you and whoever else is on there talking about what's going to happen. And it makes me think a lot of people who transport humans during times of oppression or warfare, like the mules bringing people from Central and Latin America across the borders, the people who were smuggling Jews out of Europe. It's like they're limited in what they can actually inform you about, because they are not the deciders of what's happening. They are, if anything, go-betweens. They're passing as legitimate land people, right? And what people don't know is, in between them seeing them on the land, they're out here smuggling people on the boat. And it's an emotional, the water aspect is an emotional purpose. It's not so intellectualized, but it requires aligning our emotional purpose with our intellect so that we can actually execute the plan that we prefer, as opposed to just feeling resolved, right? Like people who are still in the Five of Swords, or people who are in the Seven of Swords in that context. Five of Swords is like people who would have, or who tried to help and it went badly, and then they're even more traumatized and maybe even resentful. Like, why do you have to why do you have to be a Jew and need help? I tried to help last time and everybody got killed, and now I feel even worse about myself, so I'm definitely not going to help you, and if anything, I'm just going to. And then you get the Seven of Swords where it's like, well, fuck it all. I'm just going to do this system so that I never have to get on that boat again, because I can't take that responsibility. It's like too much to be neutral. And so it's these very intellectually negotiative states in the 5 and the 7. And the 6 is just like almost just resolve. Like, don't ask me too many questions. I'm going to get you on this truck. I'm going to get you across the border. And after that, what you do is your business. I don't know none of that. I only know about transport.
You just like, that was so good. I love the idea of Six of Swords being like emotional intelligence. I love the idea of wow, you just like blew my mind with that connection between 6 and 7, because it's like, maybe to me, like the 7 is like when you give the keys to the ego, and the ego's gonna fuck it up because you're like, I feel wounded, and then the ego's like, well, I'm gonna like protect you.
Yes.
Not good, which I'm gonna talk about with one of the other cards later. Yeah, thank you.
Yeah.
There's a lot that I want to reflect on. So I guess we're probably gonna, y'all, we're gonna make this 2 episodes. So this is probably where it's gonna get cut off. The next card I'm going to talk about is the 10 of Pentacles. In the 8th house tarot, it's 10 of Earth, and it's Mercury and Virgo. So we've got some Mercury again. And Virgo, we think about practicality and sustainability and body related and physical presence related types of ways of looking at things and communicating and being, so like very somatic, I think Mercury and Virgo is like a very somatic way of communicating. So what I think about the 10 of Pentacles, and this is something I like talk about with my students a lot, is this idea of like generational wealth, and how it's sort of, in a capitalist, white supremacist, colonial framework, generational wealth is about protecting those closest to you. And that's it. Like, it's sort of like, there was a documentary that came out when I was in college, like a million years ago, like literally all like 15 years ago or something. It was about Walmart. And about the Waltons, and how I remember the thing that really stood out to me in that documentary was about how the Waltons, they were at the time like the richest people in the world. They were paying all their employees minimum wage and then not giving them enough hours so that they could get health insurance. So like the employees were like, and they were only promoting white men. Basically, like this whole documentary was just like tearing a new one to the Waltons. It actually really affected them. They actually did some changes. But one of the things that stood out to me is that while they were doing all this environmental degradation and destruction to keep themselves rich, they were also building themselves underground bomb shelter houses in case we go to war and or have climate apocalypse, both of which are likely, climate apocalypse definitely, or another story.
Already.
Yeah. So
all around.
They were investing their money in building underground shelters for them with like 500, like 50 years of food or something, dry food, instead of like paying their workers like a living wage. And to me, that is like the most corrupt, the most shadow of the 10 of Pentacles. It's about supplying for you and yours and being like everyone else is on their own. That is what we've, become, in late capitalism, as, collectively as a nation. And yet that is so not what the 10 of Pentacles is about. We see in the Pentacles, unlike the Swords, where like the further on in the suit, it's like more burdensome. And then you get to the 10 and you're like, which I thought you were going to talk about that today. But so many, because I have like so many references in my cards to like 10 of Pentacles stuff, or 10 of Swords kind of energy. But with 10 of Pentacles, we see, in the Smith Rider-Waite, there's the elder, there's like the 2 like mothering figures, and then there's like the children and the dogs. So what I see with that is like intergenerational wealth that is not about hoarding wealth. It is about sustainability. So what I always think about is the 7 generation model. And I did like a little bit of research. I'm not, super educated, but the Haudenosaunee, I think, I don't know if I'm pronouncing that right, the Haudenosaunee people of the Longhouse from what's now called upstate New York, in Canada, what much of the so-called US government was modeled off of their methodologies, and what the idea was, you always do everything with 3 generations before and 3 generations after in mind. And that's like obviously an attitude that we do not have now. We don't have that, like the way, and I think that's kind of like the okay boomer thing, like I think a lot with like, I have a lot of comfort, with my mom. Whenever I talk to my mom, we always end up talking politics. And I have had these conversations, like last year, we had a lot of conversations where she would be like, okay, I see what you mean. All cops are bad. Prisons are bad. Okay, I get it. But then the next time I talked to her, she'd be like, no, but I like figured it out. Like some cops are good. and I'd be like, Mom, you're like, that you're doing the okay boomer thing. You're like doing the, like you're like not, listening, or like, the idea of like American history was so great, and how a lot of like white baby boomers hold on to this. And even like, younger people as well hold on to this idea of like America is so great. Whereas this is actually a result of like a large cultural gaslighting, and cognitive dissonance, where the truth sometimes is so painful that you can't actually see it, so you avoid it. Again, that comes up with Six of Swords also, I think.
Absolutely.
But I think with the Ten of Pentacles, what we look at it is like, what am I doing for myself that will therefore benefit those around me? And sometimes that's just like doing your own self-care, like sometimes that's just like trying to show up better in spaces for those around you. But when I think about Ten of Pentacles, I definitely think of this idea of, like ancestral connection, not only connection to blood family, connection to communities, and just like the awareness of like what we do, it holds a legacy. And what I love about a lot of your work, and like you're very generous, like I haven't been on Instagram in a while, but like you're very generous with like your own familial legacy. And that, I was thinking about that when you were talking, about the aftermath of grief, and like filling the space with someone that is missing from your life, that you're still like figuring out how to utilize that space. Like that is the honor, because the seeds that you plant in that space, like the way that you honor that space is how it grows. So it really does leave that opportunity when someone passes, when someone moves on, to be like, how do we cultivate life in this person's honor, instead of just bulldozing everything and being like, gotta get back to work, my 401k, etc.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Yeah, I love so much about that. And also, yeah, of course. I mean, I always love the Ten of Swords. I feel like the Ten of Swords is a card, and maybe that's just the thing about tens, that like they're applicable in any situation. Because I'm actually looking at my cards and like, wow, I didn't pick any pentacles, which
Mhm.
is surprising because one would think, we're talking about climate collapse, we're talking about what we thought would be a post-pandemic. We're talking about very earthbound issues. And yet I guess I didn't choose any pentacles because I am recognizing the aspect of all of this that is so that has nothing to do with earth, other than that we're making it have to do. You're like, we're instigating this situation on our our parent planet. um and so I guess I'll just do my other minor arcana, because we're talking minor arcana. I chose the Seven of Chalices, Seven of Cups. Um, and I chose it, and I was kind of surprised because when I got your email, sometimes when you send me an email, I'll just sit in that moment and think what comes to me immediately, before I have any time. And I thought Six of Swords, and then I thought Seven of Chalices, and then everything else that came to me other than the Ten of Swords was major arcana. But I chose the Seven of Chalices because I think it's very much, well, one, just like cups, our emotions, emotional intelligence. I always say in my readings, emotional intelligence is a 4-step process. Step 1 is you feel away. Step 2 is you recognize you feel away. Step 3 is recognizing that you feel away. You actually look back on your personal history and think of all the times that you might have felt that way, or all the people who might have helped you feel that way, and all the ways you've behaved as a result of feeling that way. And then step 4, after that review, you act. But I always like to tell people, in a white cis heteropatriarchal world, it's just steps 1 and 4. I feel, I act, which creates rage. It's like, I'm just punk life. And all the rich accountability that comes from recognizing how we feel and reviewing how we ended up feeling that way is what allows us to actually be emotionally intelligent and at peace, or at least neutrality with our emotional circumstances. So I always like cups, because even though when it comes up, a lot of people are like, oh, romance or one-on-one relationships or creativity or my purpose. Whenever I see cups, I think about emotional intelligence. And I like the Seven of Cups for how we, survive or thrive through a pandemic and climate collapse, because it's very much a card about choices. It's very much a card about like what is presented to you and what what choice you're going to make. In fact, in the Numinous Tarot by Cedar, they have a gender non-conforming deck, which I really enjoy, and their cups are vials. But what I really like about their Seven of Cups for the viewers who are watching is that it's an apothecary.
Mm.
And the individuals just looking at all the different kinds of bottles and making an assessment about what they actually need for the moment, for the healing, for the circumstances. And I've always really liked that about the Seven of Cups. Like even in Menzel's, it's like someone's always sitting in contemplation, considering their options. And then, of course, in the traditional tarot, it's more like in the clouds, But like, take your choice now. And then what I love about it is that each cup has a different sort of outcome in it. Especially in like, this is the herbal tarot, which I know you have, but I always liked in this one, there's like a dragon and a heart and a castle and like a theater mask. And you're like, okay, well, how I think the Seven of Cups, along with the major arcana cards, is the thing that keeps people, it's like the story that we tell about why we are fighting. It's like the thing that you put your kid to bed with during post-apocalyptic times or during scary times to help them sleep, to make sense of the horror. It's very like Life is Beautiful to me. Like that whole movie is about a father trying to preserve his child's innocence in the worst of circumstances and saying to himself, okay, I have to deal with this reality, but like my child does not have to deal with this reality if I can help it. And so with the Seven of Cups, it feels like the adults card in this circumstance, like the grown-up card, the elder card, because that at that age or at that position in society, you are more capable of perceiving the potentialities and the options. You're not necessarily responsible for bringing all the cups, because I think that children and youth are very informative about these things, but you're the one who ultimately is going to decide which chalice is chosen. And then like the last image it always brings to me, of course, is Indiana Jones, which I think is like Raiders of the Lost Ark. I could think where he's supposed to pick Jesus's cup. And the challenge is that there's all these cups in the room, and some of them look like gold and silver, and people make all these assumptions like, Jesus would only drink out of the best, it's Son of God, whatever. And Jesus has the shittiest cup in the room.
Yeah.
And it's all about perception. It's all about what you've actually learned from the history that you have accepted as canon. And some people believe the Roman Catholic history of Jesus, and some people actually read the book and they realized that he was born in a manger, so his parents was broke. And I think that is kind of what I like about the Seven of Cups. It's about lore, it's about options, it's about what we think of as choices, and there's hope, but it's also based on the preferences of the individual in the driver's seat, which for each of us is our own life. So it's like all the choices that we make up to the climax or up to the goal point that we imagine we're trying to get to, and whether we actually chose the tools that we needed. So I kind of like the Seven of Cups because I don't think of cups as a very neutral suit. But I think that the Seven of Cups, unlike like the Seven of Swords, unlike the Seven of Swords, or even the Seven of Pentacles, which Seven of Swords seems kind of negative. Seven of Pentacles is kind of positive. Seven of Wands, I read it both ways, but the Seven of Cups is kind of like, well, what are you going to make out of it? And I think a lot of us are asking ourselves that question, because before COVID, a lot of people were like, this is all it can be. What do you mean? It's this or it's collapse. It's this or it's anarchy. And then you get into the collapse and people are like, whoa, we don't have any more options. Wait. And I wrote an article about this, which is like, everybody wants a revolution until there's blood in your fucking water and you don't know where the next meal is coming from. And the land that's being bombed is the one that you have to live on and breathe and eat from. And then you're like, wait, I don't know if this was such a good idea, because ultimately I mean, and you haven't been on an IG, so we haven't had these conversations, but like, I've been thinking about the Audre Lorde quote, you know, that people love to use: the master's tools will not dissemble the master's house. I'm probably butchering that quote, but it's like that. And I think that's I think that quote, I think the way that Audre Lorde meant it makes complete sense. I think the way that people continue to use it doesn't make as much sense, because first of all, what I wrote in my post is like, first of all, who are we calling master? Because I'm not just going to call anyone master, okay? And then second of all, if we're talking about it in the context that people like to use it, which is like white supremacy is never going to deconstruct white supremacy, I'm like, the irony is that it is, because you're assuming that white supremacy is mastery over race or intellect. It's mastery over delusion. So the paradox is that when you're a master of delusion, you do deconstruct your house because that's what you're mastered at what's confusing and doesn't make sense. And so we see, whether it's patriarchy or white supremacy or classism of any kind, including like environmental classism, it deconstructs the ability for humanity to sustain itself. So whatever, maybe it's mastery of limitation or mastery of hatred or mastery of delusion, but like that kind of mastery does deconstruct its own house. And that's the kind of situation that we're in when we are in a Seven of Cups situation, when we're like, okay, I'm dreaming of the future and what future is possible. And oftentimes we're in a state where we're like, oh, you know, out of all the histories that we've had, this one seems like the most sustainable. And yet that's the house we're inheriting. So I like the Seven of Cups because it's usually outside. It's usually denoting like a breaking away from tradition. And yet it's pregnant with options, because we don't yet know what this person thinks, like where humanity should go. And I think that's true of all of us. Like no one person has the answer of like the perfect society. And when people suggest that they do, like when it kind of is like, this is the only way that you can be free, I'm like, you're on that polarity situation. You're doing something else, because this card is about multidimensionality. It's about options. It's not about the binary at all. But we do fixate and think it is, simply because in a capitalist framework, it has to be vertically hierarchical as opposed to horizontally. I was like, what direction goes out? The hot dog way. So yeah, that's why I chose this.
The hamburger.
Yes. Yes, the hamburger way, yes.
Thank you. That was amazing. And I feel like, so I'm going to talk, it's funny because you're talking about the Seven of Cups. We kind of touched on the Seven of Swords. And I'm going to talk about the other two sevens. But that I'm totally going to like look at your Instagram and read that post, because that's interesting. I love that Audre Lorde quote. I want to hear what you have to say about it. I feel like people use that quote to be like, I don't know. I think people, yeah, I could see what you mean. I'm curious to what you say, what you wrote about how they use that quote out of context. And I think also, like, for me, and I won't get into this like in great detail, but for me as someone who has been like studying anarchism for a long time, but was like hesitant to call myself that for a long time, because I was like, well, I don't have it all figured out. And like, I can't perfectly explain it. And then I was like, well, I couldn't explain, how many people that are capitalists can explain why they're, so I feel like that is a real thing to look at, is like, yeah, I would love to see the system as it is collapse, but then we have to look at the fact, like, who has the guns, who has the land, who has the resources, what are they going to do if the system as it is collapses? I think about that with like, friends that I have doing a lot of organizing in communities that are actually working to defund the police. I think like, a lot of the rural areas in the Pacific Northwest have long-standing histories of like white supremacy. So, but then they also have like long-standing history of like radical anti-capitalist thinking as well. And what happens when these two things clash? And I think that's what we saw in Portland last year a lot, is like these two extreme sides clashing. And then it's like, we have to have systems figured out, like, it, you know, and that goes back to like my feeling on the Knight of Wands, who's not considering those things. And it's just like, yeah, revolution. And like, it's like, who's going to be harmed by a revolution? Like, who is going to be harmed by a revolution? Who's going to suffer? And, but then like, who's suffering in the current system? You know, like, it's kind of the same. But anyway, yeah, that's super interesting. I'm going to move on to Seven of Pentacles.
Lovely.
So
Seems like such a hopeful card for.
I think so. And I think
Yes.
Seven of Cups is helpful. So Seven of Earth, Saturn and Taurus, which I love that. I wonder what's going to happen when we move into that transit in a couple of years, Saturn and Taurus, because we think about like the earth-based energy, the self-care related energy, the sexual energy of Taurus with this like structure and rule-based identity of like Saturn. And when I
relationship reformation, that's what I think.
Yeah, definitely. Really, yeah, the change, and that'll be interesting for like the lovers year too, like next year being the lovers year. And I think with like the Seven of Pentacles, a few things you said in the beginning reminded me of this about grief and making space, because one of the reasons that I love, like, I do think Seven of Pentacles is very pertinent to this like quote unquote post pandemic world, like climate collapse world. Seven of Pentacles is important because we have to assess what our priorities and needs are and what we have the capacity. So again, kind of like maybe like I'm in star thinking mode, but I relate to Seven of Pentacles in two ways. One, as a gardener and an herbalist, because we think about relationship to the land and being realistic with our crops and our harvest. But I also think of it as someone with a research background, because in research, you take time, you know, to collect data, and then you go into the assessment. And when you go into an assessment or when you're doing a harvest, you have to be realistic with yourself about what's working and what's not working, what is yielding a crop and what is not. Maybe you had big ideas about what you wanted to do. You know, again, Pentacles is about being practical. It's about being earth-based. It's about being, you know, in the material world to some extent. So with the Seven of Pentacles, I think about, you know, again, with like grief, this idea of like losing someone or something, or losing even like an opportunity or like an outlook, which a lot of us are doing right now in this time, is just like our expectations for our own lives are having to change based on like what we're dealing with collectively. The Seven of Pentacles is there to be like, so the places where things aren't working, it's time for you to tear that out, tear out what's dead, you know, tear out what's not bringing you life, and think about planting new seeds in that place. So when I think about Seven of Pentacles, I think like adapting to climate change, for example. It's like, I've been thinking about a lot, like water, you know, I've been doing a lot of research about compost toileting, have like done, you know, on the property I live on, have done some of that, like in my van life, I've done some of that. And like the idea of like compost toilets, the idea of just like composting rainwater catchment systems, like irrigation systems that are sustainable, and like the way that on a larger scale, our society, you know, there's a lot of data out there about water waste, and like, you know, there's we're in extreme drought, you know, and I saw that in my travels this year, like just looking at these forests that are clearly very dehydrated, like, and very dry, and then like, you know, very susceptible to the fires that are on their way. So it's like looking at, you know, the way that we sustain water, the way that we sustain resources, like what are our food supplies looking like, and how we are in a time where, again, we're talking cognitive dissonance and sort of this idea of like people having a disconnect between like understanding like the realities that we're facing and like wanting to continue to live how they've always lived. But like the Seven of Pentacles, to me, it really calls in this idea of like having to get real with yourself and assess what it is that you're capable of, what you have access to, and how it needs to change based on like what's around you changing. And I forgot to say flower essences for Ten of Pentacles. That I said, any, you know, Ten of Pentacles essence, I think anything that is related to your ancestry. So like, I, you know, worked with olive essence because of my Mediterranean ancestors, also Angelica essence. And then for the seven, I think clematis, and then tansy, because we're thinking about focusing, bringing attention to getting clear about like what we want. And I think also because we're talking about sevens, like seven is the real, the card of like an assessment, a process, an initiation, a choice. It is kind of like the card of like slowing down and looking at what's around you and like deciding what you want, where you want to go next. There's a lot of like open doors when you get to a seven.
Absolutely. Yeah. Whatever way you want to take that. Whether you want to go the Seven of Swords way or the Seven of Pentacles way.
Mhm.
Yes. Okay. So the first major that I'll just talk about the majors in the order that they come up. But I chose the Fool. I think um in a pandemic and climate collapse, you don't get there without the Fool. That's for sure. And the Fool starts all of our journeys. Something I wrote recently is that, when we say like the cards that were dealt by the universe, the the trick in that statement is that everyone is dealt all the cards, right? We all get the tarot deck. We all start with the Fool. The order of the cards from there is completely contingent upon who we are as people and our preferences. Some people go from the Fool straight to Swords. Some people go from the Fool to Pentacles. Some people go from the Fool to the Devil to the Hierophant to the Emperor. And that it just depends on your journey.
Mhm.
And so we all are the Fool. The human journey is a fool's journey, but the elevated Fool is the one who gives everything that they have to the present moment. And so they don't have to worry about the future because they know they give everything they have to the present moment, and they don't have to worry about the past because they know they gave everything they had to the present moment. And so there's a real concentration of knowledge in that sort of faith, um, with etymology of faith meaning to trust, to confide, to persuade, is true faith. Where, if you trust, then there's nothing to doubt. If you're confident, then there's nothing to be insecure about. If you're persuaded, then what else is there to say? So with the Fool, when the Fool is actually in neutrality and alignment, the Fool is living their life without assumption and without expectation, and making no promises to anybody other than I'll show up on the day and we'll see what happens. And I think that sort of regenerative quality is really necessary in any sort of collapse, and in any sort of health crises. People have to have the ability to show up fresh. And we find that through history, you have to find your regeneration somewhere or the fight is actually lost. And the moment that faith goes out the building, or confidence in living, people become really desperate. And this is where we see all the terror. This is where Walking Dead comes in, and you're like, are the zombies more dangerous than the people? I don't know. And that's the politics of the show, which is like, are the circumstances what make you dangerous, or are your choices what make you dangerous, and or make things dangerous? And I appreciate the Fool because if you can master that journey, you almost have nothing to worry about. Like, there literally is nothing for you to worry about, because the mastery of that journey is I show up every day, I give everything that I have, I sleep peacefully, and I wake up and I do it all again. And so there is a emotional honesty in the Fool that I think is really cool to start out tarot with, and to start out the journey of the archetypes, the human archetypes with. And it's just necessary to have people who keep don't know mind. So the Fool is also like children, right? You can be anything you want to be. You can do anything you want to do. And then they become an adult and they're like, what kind of crackpot idea is that? Who told you that? And you're like, y'all told me that when I was a kid. But we need that energy.
Mhm.
We need a generation that's going to come with neutrality at the very least, and with hope and positivity for what can be done with the time in front of them, which is now. And I think that's what Gen Z is here to sort of educate us about. Like, God only knows what Gen A. Do they go to A after Z? I don't know. So God only knows what Gen A is going to do, because they're growing up in the evidence, the unequivocal evidence of human and climate collapse, but or humans sustaining climate collapse. And so that energy, that naivete, that fresh perspective is both what can keep you alive and get you killed, but you need it either way. And so there's no going on the tarot journey without the Fool. You need the Fool. You need to have those moments of legitimately not knowing. And it's we talk all those things in the swords that make us resentful of the journey, right? Like the whole idea of supremacy ideation in a patriarchal classist world is like, if I don't intend for this ahead of time, and if I don't supply all these resources, like, right, these Walmart people, they're like, I don't know if I want to live with these people, but if I am, I'm going to do it in a bunker. You know, it's like all this preparing for the worst, assuming the worst of yourself and of others and of humanity and even of the environment, is how we got here. Whereas if every day we woke up and we're like, well, let's see what we do with what the day is, as opposed to being like, this is just the way things are, we would live in a much less predictable world, but it also might be less predictably negative. And I think that's kind of the magic and the bomb, BALM, also though BOMB, depending on the kind of Fool you have, that the Fool offers, especially as a starting point. Like, you can't help, like, we're in a new unprecedented situation for our times, right? Like, we're not the people of Pompeii, we're not the people of the Roman Empire collapse, we're not the people of the, you know, Aztec and Maya collapse. So the way that we deal with this is new because we're in it for the first time ourselves, and we have to respect that. You know, we're not going to have all the answers, and we're also going to likely fuck things up, but we're going to succeed as well along the way, because all of those things are available to the Fool's journey. We just don't appreciate how volatile that knowledge is, because we think that knowledge should come in some sort of like orderly, predictable, accessible manner. But all the other cards in the tarot suggest that that's not how knowledge comes in, and the Fool starts you off on that at 0. You know, so that's why I like it for this.
That makes a lot of sense. What kind of Fool are you gonna be in this coming time? Yeah. What it's funny because like I was like, oh, I'll go next to 7 of Wands because we were doing 7, but then I also, my last card is Judgment, and I feel like a lot of Judgment ties into the Fool, so maybe I'll go with Judgment. And Judgment, of course, many know about like astrology, is Pluto, my favorite planet ever. So I thought about Judgment because it's, you know, sort of like a lot of related to what you're saying about the Fool. It's like Judgment is a 10. So it is a 10. You know, it's not always classified as a 10, but since it's 20, you know, it reduces down to 10. So we think about it in that energy of finality. But Judgment is this energy of like, okay, if you want to start this new chapter, what exactly do you want to bring into the new chapter? What do you want to leave behind? So I think about, again, like accountability, making amends, a deep reflection, a mirror holding up to ourselves, a reminder that we can change the future by making peace with the past. And it's also sort of like a what goes around comes around card. So again, it's sort of like when I think of Judgment, and I think of this was like Pluto, our Pluto placements in astrology tell us where kind of our shadows lie, where the hidden parts, you know, where is it that we struggle in a way that we don't really want other people to see, you know, where we don't, like, our shadow self is sort of like, you know, a lot of times we want to hide it because our shadow self is often the one that's not acceptable in like mainstream society, or even it's a part of us that could be harmful to other people or to ourselves. So we want to like cloak the shadow self in a lot of ways. But the thing is, I think the power is bringing that out and like showing what it is and healing it and knowing it well. Because my belief is that if you don't know what your shadow side is, it's going to rule your life. It's going to control you. And if you can't acknowledge your shadow side, then you're not going to start a new chapter anew, really. You know, like it's sort of like, with nonviolent communication, and with, being trauma informed. Like sometimes, and I don't know if you've ever had this happen, but like you can get in an argument with someone about something, and then you don't really want to talk about, that argument maybe is rooted in like something that you were holding a grudge about or like some concern you have, and you don't really want to go there. So then you just don't talk to that person for a while. And then the next time you see them, you're like, oh, hey, what's up? And you act like nothing happened because you're like, I just don't have the capacity to deal with this. But the thing is, that's not sustainable. That means you're bringing that judgment into the new chapter of your relationship with that person. When the actual sustainable movement forward is about like having a conversation, being real with all of the stuff that happened. And I think of that, like in the current times we're living in, there's more discussion, about reparations, about land back movements. And these are things that are, some people are like, and I go down like YouTube black holes, now TikTok, now that I'm not on Instagram, I'm like going down like TikTok black holes about like people that are like, the past is the past, like get over it. And then it's like, okay, but like the past is the shadow, the past is the soil, it's the soil where the seeds are planted. And if you can't amend the soil, you're going to have the same crop over and over again. Going back to Seven of Pentacles, you got to look at that crop and what's in your soil. So when I think about judgment, I think about like you need to take a hard look. And it's funny because, not funny haha, funny like curious. A lot of students, in my Tarot School for Liberation class, I assigned one major arcana per person in the class. And a lot of people that get judgment have said, like, I had to get real about something in my life that was hurting me. And I think that comes up a lot of times in my readings with clients. If judgment comes up, it's like, you don't need to tell me right now. You don't need to see in this reading, but like, you need to think about it because there's something there that you're not dealing with. And if you don't deal with it, it's going to, it gets more control. It takes over more space in your life. So if you deal with it, then you can emerge as like the evolved fool.
Absolutely. Yeah, I was thinking, oh, what a great pair Judgment and the Seven of Pentacles is, actually. Because it's being honest about what's there. Rather than imagining the wonderful apples that you like, being like, is the apple tree growing apples though? Did you plant it correctly? Which is funny because the elevated fool. So I was talking to Corinne about this before we started the podcast, but I do this activity where I look at the major arcana and I see what seems like the elevated aspect of the earlier major arcanas, if anything. I don't even know if the majors are even, so I don't know if this necessarily comes out like that. But I think of the elevated fool as the hanged person, often the hanged man in tarot. And the reason I think that is because the fool is authentically like authentically, genuinely not looking at the bigger picture. That's not within the fool's capacity. They don't have that range of vision or perception. So they legitimately give themselves over to everything they have in the moment. And ideally, through the repetition of moment to moment decisions, they create a pattern that's effective, right? Because it's not necessarily about forgetting with the fool. It's just about what you actually have the capacity for. You give your full capacity and then you give it again. It's not like you don't consider what that capacity did, but that doesn't happen that often in the fool. But when you get to the hang person, I think you do, because, well, my favorite hang person, I have a bunch of decks open right now. Because, we know the traditional hang person looks like this. In the herbal tarot, it's someone underwater. In the African American tarot, it's a medicine person with a bunch of eyes floating around them, which I like. But my favorite one is actually Menzel's tarot, even though it's not the least traditional, because the hang person is on a string over the globe. For those of you who are just listening and not watching, and there's an earth and there's a hanged person on a rope in the cosmos. And what I really like about it is that I think that the hanged person is oftentimes like set in the same circumstances as the fool. But the difference is that the hanged person has a, this isn't exactly the language that I would use if I had thought this out earlier, but like the hanged person has like a calculated faith. The fool has a innate faith. They just trust because they have their experience and that's what they know how to trust, so that's what they throw themselves into. The hanged person is like after a significant amount of day-to-day, moment-to-moment acts, what with the bigger picture do we actually want from the trajectory of our choices? And so the hanged person is still in a situation where they're not necessarily able to predict what's coming, but they're in a place knowing that that is okay too. The fool isn't even thinking about what's coming. The fool's just like, this is in front of me, I'm going to deal with this. The hanged person is like, oh, I see this line of things that I'm set up for. I'm not necessarily knowing how I'm going to get through it, but I have the fool's faith and I have a lifetime of experience of surviving my choices. So I'm just going to go do this. And so the blindfoldedness is a choice, right? The fool isn't blind in any of their images, but they're not looking. And then the hanged person is looking, but they're blindfolded. And so it's this inversion of, and I think of this too as like the difference between the Knight of Cups and the King of Cups. It's like the Knight of Cups is sincere about what they're doing, but they are learning through osmosis. And so, you know, they can be sincere about loving you one day and sincere about loving somebody else the next day, because they're just going to be honest with you about where they're at in the moment. Whereas the King of Cups has lived that Knight of Cups experience and is now cultivating a particular emotional lifestyle and intending for something. And that doesn't mean that they don't change, but it means that they are aware and calculating how they're making those choices. Whereas the Knight is like, I have to live this to know it. It's through osmosis. And, you know, usually the Knights are through osmosis. So I think of the hanged person as like, okay, now that I've lived all that experience, I can take a seat or I can hang out and consider what all those choices actually are leading me into. And that's, I guess, why I like the Manzel's one so much, because it's like how you conduct yourself in the world, how you make your way around the world, how you go through the world. And I think that even though it's scary to, in an ableist culture, to be without a sense that the culture has so made life, you know, dependent around, that once you realize you can navigate that way, you almost wonder what else that humanity gave you that you can navigate with or without. And then you're really calculating in the same way that you are in the Seven of Cups, but you're doing it from a place of spiritual awareness as opposed to emotional, you know, feelings at the time, which I think the Seven of Cups can be more about like, what do you feel now? And the hanged person is like, oh, I'm going to have another Seven of Cups moment after this fool's journey. And so I've got to consider what I chose last time so I can decide what I want for this time. So I feel like the hanged person, the fool is each generation, and the hanged person is 7 generations. Ideally, by the 7th generation, you're able to understand what the first 6 were doing and why you are where you are, even if you don't know where you're going, which is why you're still blindfolded.
Interesting. And I also like that the Manzel's tarot depiction of the person hanging over the earth, because it's like, it made me think about, like I said, a couple nights ago, I listened to the Tarot for Liberation episode that we did, and listening to you talking about the world and how like the world encompasses everything. So it's like the hanged one is like, it almost, in that one, it's like the airplane is like bringing the person down to the world, you know, like it's like that halfway point.
Yes. So good.
And I also think like, because like some of the things that we've been talking about with like this disconnect between like people's beliefs and their actions, that is hanged one too, because it's like the people who are like, whatever, we're not gonna run out of water. Like, we're not gonna run out of water. Like, forest fires will end. Like, everything's gonna be fine. Like, that is like, when are you gonna realize that like we have to make changes as a society? And that will be, that kind of reminds me of the hanged one, is like being in denial about some things, or like being in cognitive dissonance about some things.
Yes.
Okay, so my last card, and I keep forgetting to say, I like took this time to do flower essence recommendations. So I think for judgment, Angel's Trumpet was like a big essence I was like making.
Of course.
Yeah, and because there's the Angel's Trumpet in the
Yeah.
judgment card. So I was like, oh, definitely Angel's Trumpet, like heralding us into a new time. And like Angel's Trumpet is, a subspecies of Datura, Devil's Trumpet, which I think of as more like a death or Six of Swords energy. And then I would say Hawthorn for me is an essence for judgment, because it's a 10. And like Hawthorn is kind of like a threshold or a gatekeeper. It's also like a really intense essence to work with, y'all. If you like want to know what's holding you back, what's in your heart that's blocking you, Hawthorn's great for that, but like you got to be ready. Then I also put fuchsia, same thing, like a lot of grief. Fuchsia's in the same family as bleeding heart. So anyway, like that's a little addendum. But 7 of Wands, I go off about this card, and when I teach about it, it's Mars and Leo, which made a lot of sense. I didn't know that before.
That does make lots of sense.
Yeah, because you think about 7 of Wands is like, I relate a lot to this card because I think of it as a trouble or a deficit or a maladaptive pattern in like trying to have a boundary and like it not really working out because the boundary is too defensive. It's too aggressive. It's like, and I think like a lot of us that struggle with codependency or like people pleasing, sometimes you're like nice, you're like checking in, you're nice, but you're like getting angry and you're getting angry. And then suddenly you're like, blah, blah, and then everybody's like, wait, where did that come from? And it's because like you didn't honor that inner boundary or that inner need. So it like built up, you didn't communicate it. And then the 7 of Swords comes out, or I'm sorry, 7 of Wands. So when I see 7 of Wands, the things that I always tell my students is like, look at the way bodies are positioned in the cards. And in the Wands, you see like, it's like this guy with his crew, and they're like having problems, like in the 5, they're having problems. And then the 6, they're acting like everything's great. But then in the 7, he's like up on the rock above everyone. And it's like, are these your comrades? And if they're your comrades, why are you so distrustful of them? So there's a big story with the 7 of Wands. 7 of Wands is always, when I do the reading, I look for what it shows up with, because it is hinting at a lot of things that are buried. Again, we think shadow work, Pluto, what is buried here? What's the story behind this? Because there's something here. And I know you were like, the 7 of Wands can go either way. I have a hard time with a Vol 7 of Wands. I have a hard time seeing it in any way that's like super positive. So I'm curious about that from you. But I think 7 of Wands is often about distrust, like fundamental distrust and poor boundaries and not knowing where your boundaries need to go. Defensiveness comes up with 7 of Wands. Like, are you being defensive, like overly so? Are you acting like you're being attacked when you're not? I see this a lot, doing accountability work, doing, we see this like Karens, like all the people getting videotaped, like acting out in ways that are racialized and ways that weaponize privilege and like fragility. That's very 7 of Wands to me, because you think about it and it's like, what is really this about? This is not about this one isolated incident. This is a whole network of stories that are inside of you that you don't understand. So when I see 7 of Wands, I think about like, why, is there some harm that was done to you where now you feel like you have to protect yourself in ways that are so defensive that you're actually keeping out people that are your allies, keeping out people that are your friends, that are your community, your comrades, because you can't trust other people. So to me, 7 of Wands, again, it's like rash, it's fire energy. The essences, I think yarrow, of course, because there's a boundary thing. And then I think motherwort, when I do boundary work with people and make essences, motherwort, I think it comes when you really need to tend to that inner child, when you really need like a hug. There's really like your boundary is there and your distrust is there, but really what you need is like some love from yourself. And then I also put dandelion essence. Dandelion can make you angry. You know, I've heard and I felt that with dandelion because it's a throat chakra opener and it's related to the sun. But sometimes, like, you know, the Seven of Wands happens because we're not speaking our truth. We're not setting our boundaries. So it really depends, like, what the reason that someone's getting the Seven of Wands. Is it because you need a better boundary? Or is it because, like, you have to learn how to, like, compassionately and non-violently communicate, or even like cut a cord, you know, with someone who's being toxic to you in some way, or maybe you're the toxic one. You know, I think that's like Judgment and Seven of Wands are like, you know, it's am I the toxic one in this situation, or like are both people toxic? So all of those things are like questions that come up for me with Seven of Wands.
Absolutely. Yeah, it's funny. I was looking through the traditional tarots to see the it's funny. The reason I think the 7 it can go both ways is because the 6 of wands is like really deceptive. You know, we're coming in from some win, some lull in the battle. Are you the friend or the foe? Were you the antagonizer? We don't know. We just know that you said you were going to get something done and seemingly you did. And yet when we get to the 7, you didn't really resolve the issue because now you're behind a new barrier. Then we get to the 8 and you're like launching shit. And then we get to the 9 and you built even bigger defenses. And then by the time you get to 10, it's burdensome oppression. And I think that the 7 is interesting because it's like the reason that can be positive is it's like, you know, sometimes maybe you are fighting for the wrong team. And so the 7 is like, oh shit, was I with the oppressors? Cause I gotta reassess. I don't trust these motherfuckers. Like, why was I rolling with these people? Because even in the 5, like basically when you leave 1, 2, 3, 4, by the time you get to 5, it's like you fell in with some people. And maybe they were the right people and maybe not. 6 would give short-term gains. We're thinking, oh yes, like I've solved my issues with myself and the world. And then at 7, you're like, did I? Did I now? And then you just go, and then you just like tumble down the mountain of anxieties. So I think of the 7 as kind of good in the same way as the Tower, where you're like, you didn't really need to be rolling with those people. And the fact that you are extracting yourself is necessary. Like, you need that deduction. um Ideally you just don't carry that behavior to the next community with the 7s, but I think it it's but I always love that angle. Like the 10 of swords is bad, but I'm like, but is it though? It's kind of good. It's a good hurt. It's a good hurt. I think the 7 of wands is a good check, where you're like, oh, I don't know if I'm the hero that everyone's making me out to be. In fact, these might be like my enemies around me now that I'm thinking about it. Which brings me actually to my last 2 cards can kind of go together. Ironically, the moon and the devil, although I originally had told Karina pan. So some decks have pan, some decks have the devil. I've seen a rare deck that has both. But I'll talk about the moon first because of what I just said about the 7 of wands. You know, the moon is always present, right? It's the intelligence that we ignore the most, our intuitive intelligence, which I think is a combination of all your other intelligences combined. It's when you're allowing your erotic, physical, intellectual, emotional intelligence to work as a team, a cohesive team that's progressing you through your personality and helping you develop your character. And then the moon is there to sort of help you feel it out. So I think of the moon, of course, as intuition, but like, you have to have intuition in times of crisis. Well, first of all, you just do. But like, if you listen to your intuition, it can really get you onto that 6 of swords boat when you were in the midst of something much more chaotic. And I also think of the moon as necessary when we're at that 7 of chalices moment. Like, you know, you can choose any of them. Why do you choose what you choose? You can choose it on personal history. You can choose it based on what other people are telling you to do, or you can sit there and use your gut and be like, I don't know why I'm picking this chalice, but I'm going to go with this chalice because I feel something, not based on my personal history, but just I have a sense this is what I need to do. And it's that that energy, that intuition that allows you to trust in what seems like the impossible, right? Like a better earth, a society that gets along, the end of the Holocaust, the end of a war, right? Like these are the things, the Underground Railroad. It's like without the moon, that luminous body that guides you through means, like through vibes, through things you don't understand, you're probably not going to make these brave decisions. You're not going to help someone on the Underground Railroad. You're not going to help someone get out of Germany during Holocaust because you don't, one, you don't have faith. Two, you're not going off of the idea that like something is prompting you to make that move. Intuition is like something with from outside of me that is connected to me is prompting me to do this, right? Like it's like when you walk into a store before we ever read cards, and of all the things in the store, we're staring at the cards. Like that's intuition being like, "Hey, you want to check out those fucking cards?" Um and so I think you need that as impetus. I feel like the moon is there to get you to fall over the precipice. It gets you over that 5. It gets you from the 5s of the plateau to the 6 of being in the action somehow, some way. Like even the 6 of wands, right? It's like I did something. And you need the moon to sort of feel invigorated, justified. I often think of the moon in relationship with judgment because it's a different kind of like religion. I think of judgment in affiliation with religion, because of how it's been implemented. But I think the moon is, let's say you're a pagan. It was like before judgment, there was the moon, and you had this other means of deciding things. And then why I chose Pan is because we're in a pandemic. I was saying to Kerna, Pan puts the pan in pandemic, and you need this. I mean, even the devil, right? Like in Ifa, the traditional indigenous practice of the Yoruba people of Nigeria, which is one of my practices outside of Taoism. There's 2 things I really like about the devil, what has become the devil archetype, which is Eshu in Ifa. So Eshu is a trickster. Eshu rules the crossroads as an archetypal energy. He reminds you that there are options, and also teaches you in retrospect that there were even more options than you knew you were choosing. And usually Eshu will show up in an archetypal story as the entity that challenges if you know what you know. Because the ego will be like, "Oh, I am this and I am that," and then Eshu will come through to test the viability of that statement. And so Pan is a disruptor, but what Pan disrupts is illusion, because what you imagine it would be if it was that. And so if it doesn't end up that way, that's not what it was. Another thing I really like about Ifa is that in Ifa, the shadow is an entity, it's an archetype, and you and the shadow agreed to come to Earth. The shadow agrees to be your witness so that when you return to Olodumare, heaven, whatever, the after place, the shadow holds you accountable. So all the things that you were in denial of, all the things that you were going to skirt around saying to God, the shadow's like, and then this motherfucker did this, and then they did this, and then I saw them do this, and then they did this, and then they did that. So the shadow completes you because it allows you to, it is the witness of the things that you do that you don't want to acknowledge. And so it's not an evil entity. If anything, it's your accountant. And it's in all those places that you think you're alone and no one's watching you. And it's the shadow, aka the devil, Pan, that's there with you as a witness, being like, I see you. I see what you're doing. So the reason that, I mean, one, obviously, collapse, crisis, war, these are the details of the devil, the details of Pan. And also just Pan being like young, masculine, immature energy. You think of Peter Pan, It's like someone who just wants to do what they want to do, but not alone. They want everyone to do it with them. And then when challenged, might become manipulative to make sure that everyone participates whether they want to or not. And then, oftentimes ends up like a Rumpelstiltskin. But it's like their nature, right? Rumpelstiltskin isn't like, we don't know the rest of his story. We just know he turned straw into gold for babies. He's honest. He's like, I will help you, but I need your firstborn child. So Pan and the devil, they're not dishonest. They're quite honest. But if you're not as honest as them, then the situation that they create for you is going to be more chaotic. Like, as soon as you're faced with the shadow, you should be like, okay, this is what I did. And this is what we're doing now. And then you're actually at the maturity level to have the conversation at the level it's actually being had by that archetypal energy. Whereas if you're not willing to be accountable, then it just all looks like chaos because it was the stuff you were ignoring the whole time. And so I like this energy and I appreciate this energy because in a free will society, in a choosing will society, you do need that element of option, direction, seeming direction. But then that intuition is there even further above Pan, luminous body in the sky, to cast more light on those decisions that are done in the dark, so to speak, which I think is the Pan and the devil aspect. So I like them together as a team because one seems like it's there to disrupt, the other seems like it's there to clarify. And yet they can trade roles, because we can be lunatics as well.
Mm-hmm. I love how you just combined those two parts. Because a lot of people think of the moon as like a malefic card, which I don't know. Next year is my moon year, so I hope to like go deeper into that. But I do, maybe it's just my Capricorn nature, but I do love the devil. I think the devil, and it's kind of like what you said about Seven of Swords or Seven of Wands. It's like some of these cards that are more considered malefic are actually, and that's what I say to my, my clients. I don't want to give anyone like a happy-go-lucky feel-good reading because like then I'm like, you're just wasting your money. Like, do you want to get to the root of it? So I love that. So I think that's all. Is that all of our cards?
Yeah, that's all our cards.
Wow. So is there anything this has been a super long convo. Definitely going to split it up into 2 episodes. But how can folks get in touch with you? Do you have any new awesome offerings?
Yes. Until actually I'm probably gonna close that offering. I was just thinking, I was thinking about doing my spell services, which is helping people understand what their business were, like the language behind their business ethos and their business name actually means. I did it last year in winter and I was gonna do it in winter and summer, but I actually just realized I'm probably only gonna do it once a year. So hold on that. I will have spell services in the winter. But right now, yes, I have my readings are always open. You can go to my website, sanyuestelle.com, SANYUESTELLE.com. Had to think about how I spell my middle name real quick. And then I am teaching at Witches Confluence this winter. Tickets are currently open for sale. I will be teaching a workshop I've only taught in my Dreamscapes cohort called Multidimensionality in Time Space. The byline is that's not your past life and there's no single soulmate. And so I talk to people about multidimensionality in time space and why that isn't a past life because all time exists at once, and why there is no single soulmate because we're in a free will universe. And there's no guarantee that the people you made agreements with in spirit have made those decisions when they're incarnate on earth. So you cannot be reliant upon one person. So that's the cheat if you guys want to know the short story. But I explain it with all kinds of like charts and things. So that's happening Halloween weekend, and tickets are on sale now at witchesconfluence.com. So you guys can get that. There's many tiered tickets, including tickets that are completely comped for those who are of the demographics suggested, that are the needful demographics. And then other than that, It's such a strange time for our line of business. Like, I wish I had more things to tell you about what I was doing, but like, I'm not outside yet because I don't really know what's that like with the Delta variant. I'm trying, but I'm enjoying doing one-on-one readings in a way that before I didn't enjoy as much. I think in 2019, when I thought we were going to be outside, I imagined I would be coming away from one-on-one readings and doing more group work, but obviously COVID does not lend itself to group work in person. Other than that, we have my Patreon, and actually, that's the easiest way to work with me one on one because I have a $10 group of cards and channeling meetup, and you can meet once a month and ask me whatever questions you want and get information from the group, and even get questions answered. It's like the cheapest way to get a reading, and the easiest way if you want like any more of my insight on card perspectives or on tarot or how I read. That's the easiest way to get into my school. I don't have an official school like Corinna, but if you join my Patreon, you have more of that kind of energy. But yeah, readings, which is Confluence, my Patreon, and then in October I will be starting my fall Dreamscapes cohort with Tara of the Witch's Muse, and that's for all people who want to become more aware dreamers. If you have sleep terrors, if you have, what is it called when you freeze when you're sleeping? Paralysis. If you have sleep paralysis, if you're someone who believes you are plagued by nightmares, or if you have dream guides and stuff that you want to become better at talking to, that's what my Dreamscapes workshop's for. And that starts in October. So just join my newsletter on my website and you'll be updated on all the things.
Awesome. And I'll have all those things linked in the show notes. Well, thank you. You're basically, I was like, Stan, you is basically like co-host of the Rise Up Good Witch podcast. Thank you for, like coming back after my sabbatical and doing.
Oh, it's such a pleasure.
Yeah. Yeah. And I will stop the recording.
Bye, everyone.